Perfect. So thank you again for joining us for our Shinachli Comadres National Colectivas April Comadre Cafecito in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Today we're going to be focusing on the theme of disrupting the abuse to prison pipeline for women, girls, and gender expansive youth. And we are so honored to have Yasmin Vafa, who is the co-founder and executive director of Rights4Girls. Yasmin is an award-winning human rights attorney and advocate, and her work focuses on the intersections of race, gender, violence, and the law. She is the nationally recognized expert on gendered violence and has successfully advocated for several laws at the federal and state levels, as well as testified before the U.S. Senate, state legislatures, and international human rights bodies, as well as co-authored several reports exposing widespread the criminalization of girls who have survived violence. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, and more. And she currently serves on the U.S. Advisory Committee on the sex trafficking of children and youth, and is the judicial educator for the National Judicial Institute on Domestic Child Sex Trafficking, which is an intensive judicial training that she co-designed and leads with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And is also the founding co-chair of World Without Exploitation, the nation's largest anti-trafficking coalition, with over 220 member organizations working to end human trafficking and sexual exploitation. We're so excited to have you, Yasmin. We are honored and we thank you for all of the beautiful work that you do and that you will continue to do. And prior to this conversation, we were already, talking about all of the amazing work that we have yet to do and collaborate on together. So please, see Yasmin as a part of your lineage now for this work. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight your video so that folks can see you as well. Thank you.
Thank you
and I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you today to talk about an issue that is very near and dear to the work that we do at Rights4Girls. I think it's important first to recognize that this conversation is happening against the backdrop of, a larger national conversation around the harms of systemic racism, around people really discussing an end to mass incarceration and the need to really discuss the harms of predatory policing. And at the same time, over the last several years, we have had more growing awareness and a cultural reckoning around the pervasiveness of gender-based violence, sexual assault, and brave survivors really speaking out and demanding safety and justice through the Me Too movement. But rarely has there been an opportunity to appreciate the ways in which these two movements really intersect and manifest in the daily lives of young women and girls of color. And so it's a real honor to have the opportunity to discuss some of these intersections today and how, really girls of color, young people of color, and gender expansive young people are really suffering as a result of the phenomenons of over-policing as well as under-protection at the hands of the system, both of which result in them ending up behind bars. And so I think it's really important to have that context as we really embark on this conversation around criminalized survivors and understanding the impact of the abuse to prison pipeline. And so at Rights4Girls, we are a national human rights organization based in the DC area, And we work to defend the dignity and rights of young women and girls throughout the United States. And we do so by centering the voices and experiences of our most marginalized young people. We believe that when the policies in our society are crafted to meet the needs of our most marginalized young people, it follows that the needs of everyone in society will then be met. And so we do so through policy and advocacy at the state and federal level, training and technical assistance, research, and coalition building. And so I think, the first point as we, discuss these issues in Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is also Child Abuse Prevention Month, is to really grapple with the fact that gender-based violence in this country is incredibly pervasive. I am someone who's from Iran. I'm from the Middle East. And, my whole life living and being raised in the United States, I'm used to how we talk about the ways in which women and girls are treated in other countries. We talk about the rates of violence against women in the Middle East, in parts of Africa, in Latin America, when in fact, the rates of gender-based violence here in the United States rival that of the developing world. The CDC actually released recent statistics on the crisis facing teen girls in the last couple years, where they have some of the highest levels of sexual assault and rape in the last decade. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that this is a real crisis that our own society is experiencing. Gender-based violence in the home, pervasive images of sexual violence and depictions in our media, young people experiencing and witnessing family violence, sexual violence and harassment in schools, children being exposed to dating violence at younger ages, and of course, sex trafficking and sexual exploitation in all of our communities. We have found that every single society, both rural, urban, and even tribal communities, are experiencing sex trafficking. And though gender-based violence cuts across all boundaries of race, ethnicity, and class, we know that there are some communities that are feeling this more acutely. And so it should come as no surprise that Black and Indigenous girls in particular are facing higher levels of sexual violence. And so here are just some of the more alarming stats from the last few years. 60% of Black girls have experienced sexual violence before reaching the age of 18. Native girls run the highest risk of sexual violence as compared to all girls. They're twice as likely to be raped or sexually assaulted as compared to all other races and ethnicities. And I think it's really critical that when we talk about the violence that's experienced by our Native sisters, we recognize that too often that violence is perpetrated by non-Native men. And that's really important when we have conversations about accountability. And so, again, some of these very startling statistics that we have to reckon with. And so what is the sexual abuse to prison pipeline? Well, this was a term that we coined to describe the pathways of gender violence that lead girls, and especially girls of color, into the legal system as a direct result of their victimization. Throughout the course of our research, we came to find that, in fact, sexual abuse was a primary predictor of justice involvement in girls. And so when we talk about this, it's important to note that our research and our organization focuses primarily on girls, but this phenomenon really does apply to marginalized youth. It's important to note that much of the data that we pulled comes from, the federal system as well as state juvenile justice systems, and a lot of that data is binary. But of course, for those of us who work with these young people, we know that a lot of these young girls, identify as gender expansive, they identify as LGBTQ+, and that data is not captured by the information that we are pulling. This data is not disaggregated by those factors. And so, that's just a caveat to recognize, the data is incomplete, and that's data that, we hope to capture and get. But so when we talk about that, just please know that we know those populations are also prevalent in the population of justice-involved youth. But for, our purposes, when we highlight some of these statistics, they're going to focus on girls because of the limitations. So when we started talking to young girls all throughout the country, we started to hear these very common narratives. This cover right here is the cover of our initial report from 2015 that you can find on our website. We started to talk to young girls all across the country and hear very similar stories. This is a quote from Nadia Sharif, who we quoted in our original report, and was very consistent with what we were hearing. Girls who had been locked up 10 different times within, a couple of year period. And she talks about how when she was inside, she met other girls just like her who were criminalized for innocuous offenses, things like running away from home, truancy, prostitution, even though they were minors. And that they weren't violent girls. They just had trauma. Many of them came from the same type of backgrounds, from impoverished neighborhoods. And many of them were just hurting and needed support, but were instead, relegated into the criminal justice system. It should come as no surprise that girls of color are disproportionately impacted by this pipeline. In our initial report, again, that was from 2015, so the stats are outdated at this point, but these are the latest statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which show, again, that girls of color account for only 20% of the general youth population, but are 55% of girls involved in the youth justice system. Black girls are 34% of cases. Hispanic girls are 17%. Native girls are roughly 3%. And Asian girls are roughly 1%. So again, we have some glaring overrepresentations of girls of color. And so when we looked at various jurisdictions and the national data, we were, pretty startled to find that this was a pattern. We initially thought in talking to these girls that perhaps it was just a few bad jurisdictions. But in the course of our research, we found that unfortunately, this was a larger pattern of girls who had been abused being relegated to the justice system. And so nationally, we found that over 70% of girls behind bars reported past histories of physical or sexual abuse. But in some jurisdictions, it was much higher than that. So in South Carolina, it was upwards of 80%. Oregon, over 70%. And in situations where we were surveying adults who were sentenced to life in prison as children, over 77% of those girls had histories of sexual abuse and 80% had histories of physical abuse. And so again, it was happening all over the country and it was part of a larger pattern. And so when we took those high rates of trauma together with the most common offenses for girls, it became incredibly clear that these girls were actually being punished for the abuse that they suffered. And so we wanted to highlight the most common pathways into the system. And so in our first report, we really focused on some of the lower level offenses that push girls into the youth justice system. And in our report, Criminalized Survivors, that we released last year, we focus on some of the more serious charges that tend to push girls into the adult system. But, we're going to go through essentially all of the different pathways now. So the first real pathway are status offenses. These are charges that are only applicable to young people. They're, things like running away from home, truancy, curfew violations, things that would never apply to an adult, but only apply to children. And these are very, very correlated with experiencing abuse and trauma. Instead of a law enforcement officer or a judge asking, why would a young girl be running away from her foster care placement or running away from her home, they instead punish the behavior. Of course, when you ask these girls why they run repeatedly, oftentimes it's to escape an abusive situation. Another common pathway is domestic or family violence. Back during the height of the domestic violence advocacy movement, we, fought very hard for these mandatory domestic violence arrests because DV was not taken seriously. And unfortunately, one of the unintended consequences of these mandatory arrest policies today mean that girls are routed into the system when they have, these fights with mom or fights with grandma or fights with siblings. Police are sometimes called to the home, and, they're forced to make an arrest because it's family violence. And instead of arresting the adult, they arrest the child. And so we see a number of girls being pushed into the system for these nonviolent, simple assault charges. And in fact, we did a report looking at girls in Washington, D.C. just a few years ago, and the majority of them were ending up in the system on these nonviolent, simple assault charges. And so that's a very common pathway into the system for girls. Another really troubling pathway that isn't really, looked at enough, especially for young girls, are these false reporting charges. So we'll have a scenario where a young person very courageously wants to come forward and report the sexual violence that they're experiencing. And they basically get pressured or interrogated and bullied by law enforcement, or school administrators or an abusive parent, so much so that they recant the abuse and are then charged by law enforcement for false reporting. If you may not know, there's a documentary on Netflix that's streaming right now on this very subject called Victim Suspect. The investigative reporter on the subject, talked to us about a number of cases of young girls that she interviewed, as young as 12, that have been charged with false reporting. And, this stays on their record. It's a huge, barrier for them. And, they're doubly victimized. One of the girls that we highlight in our report, she was, I believe, 17 or 18 when this happened. She ended up, being charged for false reporting, and her rapist then went on to rape 5 more women in her jurisdiction. Another common pathway that girls end up into the system is crossover youth, or sometimes called dual system youth. These are young people who cross over from the child welfare or foster care system into the juvenile justice system. Oftentimes, we know that child welfare is overburdened, underfunded. They have a huge turnover in terms of staff. And, oftentimes staff is not adequately trained in terms of being trauma informed, in terms of conflict de-escalation. And so you'll often hear about these, behavioral health issues or, conflicts that occur in the placement. And instead of de-escalating or resolving the conflict, they'll call law enforcement, and law enforcement will then make an arrest. And so we see, very often that these young people, often girls, are pushed into the justice system from child welfare. We also know that many young girls in the foster care system, especially those who are in out-of-home foster care placements, are more susceptible to child sex trafficking. And child trafficking in and of itself is a driver for justice involvement. And so that can be a driver. This, I think, is a really important quote from a young survivor, and one that I think just, stopped us all in our tracks when we first heard it. Because for so many advocates who work on systems reform and child advocacy, you're taught to think of the child welfare system as the system that is designed to care for our most vulnerable children. And I think, Native people know this best because of the harms and the detrimental legacy of the child welfare system and the boarding schools, and, just the incredible damage that was done to families and culture as a result of the child welfare system. But this is just yet another way that the system is causing egregious harm, and in certain ways setting children up for a life of exploitation and transactional exploitation. It's just unbelievable when we heard this for the first time. And what the survivor said was that foster care was the perfect training ground for a life of trafficking, because it was in foster care where she first internalized the notion of being cared for and being abused by her caretaker. And it was also in foster care where she first internalized the notion of being tied to a paycheck. And so those two realities ingrained in this young person from such a young age made the eventual transition into a life with a trafficker a seamless one for her, because she was already used to, being seen as a source of income for a family, quote unquote. And she already associated being abused as something that your caretaker did. And so, it was very normal. It was normalized for her and several other foster youth that we spoke to. And so I think this was just a very eye-opening, and I think essential for those who work in child welfare or with youth in the child welfare system to recognize. So child sex trafficking, in and of itself, leads to several other pathways. And so I think it's important just to pause and take a moment to discuss what it is we mean by child sex trafficking. Under the federal law, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA, any minor under the age of 18 who is involved in the commercial sex trade is by definition a victim of human trafficking. And the way that a commercial sex act is defined under the federal law is defined very broadly. So it's the exchange of sex for anything of value. It doesn't just have to be a monetary transaction. And so what's important about that distinction is that a child who exchanges sex with an adult for food or a place to sleep or clothing or drugs, all of those things can constitute child sex trafficking under the law. It's important.
A lot of homeless people have, or girls have called that, what is it? Survival
sex, right? We often hear of this term, survival sex. And I've worked with a lot of survivors that, sometimes take issue with that terminology because it can obscure the role of the adult sex buyer or the adult exploiter in the transaction. And it kind of puts the entire focus and onus on the person who's exchanging sex. But it's important to realize that there doesn't always have to be that third-party exploiter. There doesn't always have to be a trafficker for it to be trafficking. Under the federal law, that's trafficking, and that minor is entitled to services and protection under the federal law. So it's just important to realize it doesn't have to be, there doesn't have to be a trafficker, there doesn't have to be force, fraud, or coercion, and it doesn't have to be a child who's exploited through prostitution. Any commercial sex act. So it could be a minor who is stripping, a minor who's exploited on OnlyFans, a minor who's exploited in pornography. All of that can constitute child sex trafficking under the federal definition, which is really important to note, and where a lot of service providers draw their funding for services and support. So it's important to just have that basic understanding. And despite that definition, we know that young people are still arrested on prostitution charges throughout the country. Roughly, from the available data, it's roughly a couple hundred each year. But even if they're not arrested for prostitution, they're still arrested for charges directly related to prostitution. So things like loitering or trespass or, offenses that are directly related to their exploitation. And, it should come as no surprise that girls of color, and particularly Black children, are 5 times more likely to be arrested for these charges than white children. And of course, girls are more likely to be arrested than boys. But of course, we know, there's boys who are arrested for this, gender expansive youth who are arrested for this all over the country. So these next two pathways typically involve child sex trafficking victims and lead to adult criminal justice involvement. And the first pathway are charges related to self-defense. And these are typically, girls who are trafficked or who have been abused and feel that they need to resort to violence in order to escape that abuse or as a means of self-defense. So, we'll talk about this a little later. Some of the more cases that have been in the media have been like Centoya Brown or Crystal Kaiser, young girls who have, ultimately taken action against their exploitative adult exploiters, often their trafficker or their adult sex buyers, and then have been charged as adults and often are facing life in prison or, decades in prison for things like homicide or murder, when really, they should be, if you ask me, should not face any charges. And then the second pathway are what people call forced criminality or coerced criminal acts. And these are child sex trafficking victims who are basically coerced by their exploiters to commit other serious criminal acts, things like, trafficking other children, kidnapping, recruiting other children into trafficking, armed robbery, drug trafficking, money laundering. We have worked with survivors all over the country, who've had their credit ruined and destroyed because of their trafficker, have, federal charges because of, things that their traffickers have made them do. And so these are very serious pathways that often land young people, we're talking usually minors, in the adult criminal justice system. And, very much along the lines of the themes that we're discussing today, child sex trafficking and, adults in the commercial sex trade are overwhelmingly women and girls of color and, LGBTQ plus people of color. And so, I think it's important just to take a moment and to show a snapshot of the available data. And we just picked, a handful of jurisdictions to show just anywhere you look, essentially, how overrepresented Black and Indigenous people are. So if you look, for example, in Hawaii, we have 83% of sex trafficking survivors identify as female and 64% identified as either all or part Native Hawaiian. In King County, Washington, which is the area around Seattle, Black people are roughly 7% of the population, but we're 44% of child sex trafficking victims. Louisiana, we have 49% of child sex trafficking victims are Black girls, where they're very underrepresented amongst youth. And in Anchorage, Alaska, we have Alaskan Native people are less than 8% of the population, but they represent a third of sex trade survivors. Now, when you juxtapose that with those who are fueling the sex trafficking and perpetuating the market, you'll see a very different demographic picture. And I think it's important just to highlight why we're focusing on the buyers here. Typically, when you talk about sex trafficking, people often focus on victims and the traffickers, but they forget that, the sex trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and every dollar that is made in that industry is fueled by the sex buyer. And it's very important to realize, who those men tend to be. Again, over 95% of them tend to be men. There are some women, but if men stop buying sex tomorrow, there would not be an industry. And they tend to be predominantly white men. And so in the jurisdictions that have started to collect this information, especially in the last 5 or so years, we are seeing incredible patterns. And so again, in King County, we just saw that 44% of the victims were Black children and mostly girls. 73% of their buyers are white men. Similarly, Pennsylvania, 74%. In Ohio, 85% of the buyers identified in sex trafficking investigations were white men. And in Minnesota, this is from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force report that came out just, I think, a couple years ago. They identified the buyers in their state as, quote, white middle-aged married men who seek Indigenous women for sex. And then this, stat from the graphic, around 85% of men who buy sex online are white. That's from a 2018 Demand Abolition report that surveyed over 8,000 American men on, their tendencies and concepts around whether they buy sex, what would they how would they feel? What are their attitudes around these issues? So it really paints, I think, a powerful image around the power dynamics surrounding those who are bought and those who are buying. And again, unsurprisingly, the individuals who are bought bear the brunt of these arrests, even in jurisdictions that have disaggregated their prostitution statutes by, those who are buying and those who are selling. We see that, the individuals who are prostituted bear the brunt of arrests. And even though we talked about federal laws enshrining that children ought not to be criminalized, that they are victims, even though there's no such thing as a child prostitute, we see that children continue to be arrested and that the majority of those arrests are Black children. So, what are the consequences of this criminalization? Well, we know that if sexual violence is about control over one's body, what are some of the consequences of being confined to a system that, has all of these conditions of confinement that can, be injurious to any child, but, much less a survivor of sexual trauma? The standard, procedures for asserting authority in, a carceral system include things like the use of restraints, isolation or solitary confinement, strip searches, sometimes cross-gender strip searches, and essentially, other people making decisions about all aspects of your life: when you wake up, when you eat, when you shower, when you sleep. All of that can be even more traumatic to a survivor of sexual abuse and violence. And of course, we know that the long-term impact of these criminal records can go on to haunt and create obstacles for young people in the future. And of course, the fact that we are disconnecting these young people from their community, from their schools, from their families, just creates further marginalization. And what we know is that when survivors are sent to the system where they're getting re-traumatized without any services or support, and when they're released, they basically have more trauma than when they entered the system. And that, all of this fuels like a vicious cycle of victimization and adult incarceration. And in fact, the data supports this. So we know, according to some of the research that has come out looking at the adult women population, that women in state prisons and other female prison populations, that up to 94% have histories of physical and sexual abuse prior to their incarceration, which really supports the theory that these girls grow up and continue to have these issues and continue being criminalized. And so this really is a generational issue. So, why does the abuse to prison pipeline exist, and why does it target, girls and young people of color? In the last few years, there's been some really important research and scholarship around implicit biases, and particularly this concept of adultification bias. There was a report out of the Georgetown Law Center on Gender Justice and Opportunity called Girlhood Interrupted, which took all of the research around the biases around Black boys and how people perceive them as older than they were, and applied a similar study to Black girls, and ultimately found that as compared to white girls of the same age, that adults perceived girls that were very, very young as older and, more knowledgeable about things like sex at a very, very young age. And that ultimately the adults in the survey perceived Black girls as, less innocent, less in need of comfort and protection, and more independent. And so, ultimately, this led to further analysis that found that these girls were seen as being less impacted and traumatized by the sexual abuse that they endured as compared to white girls, and that they were ultimately seen as partly complicit and responsible for the abuse that they endured, which in turn increases the likelihood that they would be treated as offenders as compared to crime victims or child abuse victims. And so, the abuse to prison pipeline persists mainly because we refuse to value and prioritize the lives of these marginalized girls and other young people. Some of the ways that this manifests is the, profound lack of data that we have on girls in general, but also girls of color in the system, LGBTQ plus youth in the system, gender expansive youth. We still have very little screening for things like sexual abuse, trafficking, even though there's been legislation passed and that mandates this type of screening across systems. We still have a failure to contextualize the trauma that young people experience before assessing their culpability. This is what we consistently tell judges and others that we train: look behind the charge, trying to understand the context of a young person's actions, put yourself in their shoes before you make these decisions that will, throw this child off track and impact the rest of their life. The pervasive rape culture that exists that continues to glamorize exploitation, normalize sexual harm, and really dismiss the violence that young people and really women and marginalized folks experience. And of course, the impact of harmful gendered and racialized stereotypes. So, again, we talked a little bit about this, but ultimately these racialized and gender biases do shape who in our society gets to be seen and treated as a child and who gets to be seen and treated as a victim of crime. And these realities really shape and determine girls' outcomes in our legal system. And I think one of the saddest realities is that girls themselves are keenly aware of how they're viewed. We released this anthology several years ago with our partners, and it's a collection of poetry and art from girls who are incarcerated throughout the country. And there was really no prompt. It was just whatever artwork young girls wanted to contribute. And this was a prompt that one of the artists submitted. She admitted it, submitted it anonymously. And the prompt she set was how I see myself versus how the system sees me. And you could just look at it yourself, and young people themselves are keenly aware of how the system and the adults that are entrusted with their care view them, dehumanize them. And, these are the people who are responsible for, their treatment and rehabilitation, supposedly. So it's just very heartbreaking to see that young people themselves are aware and that they have very little faith in, the adults that are supposed to be caring for them and these systems that are supposed to be caring for them. And so ultimately, when these survivors aren't met with trauma-informed responses or services, we know that they engage in self-harm or substance abuse as a form of self-medication, that they're at much greater risk of recidivism. They have much of a harder time identifying safe adults to interact with, and they engage in risky behaviors and avoidance behaviors like running away. And in some of the most egregious circumstances, when the violence is ongoing and when they don't see any other opportunity for help or support, they engage in violence as a form of self-protection and self-preservation. And that takes us to these victim-defendant cases where we talked about some of these young people who are put in these, impossible situations where they feel as though violence is a last resort and their only way of surviving. And so these are just some of the cases that have made it to the mainstream. Some of them have been resolved, others are still pending. But you can just see like some of these cases were absolutely horrific. Crystal Kaiser, she was 17 years old, and her trafficker was known to law enforcement in Wisconsin for making videos and sexually abusing several other young Black girls in his community. And instead of taking him in custody and, filing charges against him, he was out in the community, and she ultimately ended up killing him. And, I think she set his house on fire, and now her case is pending. She's charged with intentional homicide, facing life in prison. Piper Lewis was 15 years old when she was sold to a 38-year-old sex buyer who drugged her over a 3-day period, raped her repeatedly, and she ended up killing and stabbing him to death. And she ultimately was sentenced to 20 years. I was one of the people who testified in her trial as an expert witness, trying to make the argument that, she deserved sympathy and support. And, we were able to convince the judge to suspend her sentence, and she's on probation, but, she has that on her record. Tiffany Simpson is another young, teenager who at 7 months pregnant was tried as an adult in a 21-count indictment for trafficking a 13-year-old. Again, this is a forced criminality case. And Zeffie Trevino was another really sad situation where the 16-year-old child trafficking survivor was facing capital murder charges in Texas for the death of her adult sex buyer. Her trafficker ended up killing him when a robbery went awry. She wasn't even in the house when it happened. She was outside, but she ended up taking a 12-year plea deal in that case. And so she's now in an adult prison in Texas. And so these cases, again, we're talking about all girls of color except Tiffany. But in all of these situations, we're talking about marginalized girls who had traumatic childhoods, lots of, adverse childhood experiences, high ACE scores, and, kids in need of support, like Nadia said. And so when we look at ways to disrupt the pipeline, ultimately, investing in prevention of childhood sexual abuse is one of the key ways that we can prevent this from happening in the first place. Incredibly important to find methods to hold accountable those who perpetuate harm against our young people, making sure that accountability is directed towards those who are harming girls, women, and children instead of criminalizing the survivors themselves, and making sure that we're, acting to change the conversation amongst our colleagues, amongst our community, talking with girls and youth about healthy relationships, about consent and mutuality, as well as online safety. There's a number of federal bills that are pending in Congress right now to increase accountability for tech platforms, to increase regulations of online service providers. All of them are languishing. And, we are just seeing the harms of these platforms, and children need to be talked to about the risks associated with online platforms, especially at a time where exploiters are becoming much more sophisticated and the risks to young people are just increasing daily. We also need to identify more gender responsive and culturally appropriate services for young people. Making sure that we are identifying screening tools and screening all youth upon intake, whether it's through child welfare, juvenile justice, the courts, and making sure that we are directing any youth who's identified with abuse or trafficking into appropriate services, creating multidisciplinary teams and responses for child sex trafficking, as well as adopting laws and policies to end the criminalization of sexual assault and trafficking survivors for offenses that stem from their victimization. And, connected to that, making sure that we have opportunities to clear their criminal records. You related to that, I think making sure that we're promoting pathways to employment and stability for survivors and those who are vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation, particularly now as we're in an economic downturn, promoting alternatives to detention as the norm, trying to promote improved data collection. And if our states and governments aren't doing it, trying to create, partnerships with community-based service providers and agencies where we can collect that data and make sure that we're capturing information about the youth that we serve. And so here are just a list of some of the promising legislative responses that do the work of, trying to disrupt this pipeline, these safe harbor laws that are designed to protect child victims from prosecution for prostitution offenses. But in our latest report, we make clear that absent, robust screening mechanisms and resources for training and implementation, these don't really serve their purpose unless there's robust resources poured into them and screening. Vacator and expungement laws, as we said, about 38 states have these laws that allow survivors of trafficking to clear their criminal records if they result from trafficking. The VCO loophole, this is important for states that still have this exception, as we talked about. Status offenses are those innocuous, non-crimes, those offenses like running away and truancy. And when the juvenile justice federal law was passed, this JJDPA, we were prohibited from incarcerating children for status offenses. But in the 80s, when the tough on crime wave was happening, this loophole, this exception was created that you could incarcerate a child for a status offense as long as they were in violation of a valid court order. And so this VCO loophole allows you to bypass that requirement. And so, eliminating this loophole would really benefit girls in particular because they're overrepresented among status offenders. And many states have already done this. And, the judicial organizations like NCJ, FCJ, and others have a lot of guidance that support the elimination of this VCO exception. And so if your state doesn't have this, we would very much recommend that you introduce legislation and work to close this valid court order exception. And in terms of some specific legislative responses at the federal level right now, we have two really promising bills, the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, which is a bipartisan bill that would provide federal criminal record relief. So as we talked about, many of these survivors have been forced by their traffickers to commit federal crimes, and this would allow them to have their records cleared if they can show that their crimes were a result of their trafficking victimization. It also provides an affirmative defense that they can argue up front as a defense to a charge in a prosecution. And the second is called Sarah's Law. It basically would allow judges to provide trauma-informed sentencing for situations where a child sex crime victim is accused of harming their abuser or their exploiter. And so in that case, a judge can deviate from mandatory minimums or, other sentencing guidelines when it's clear that the child before them is accused of harming their exploiter. And so, both of those federal bills are really promising and bipartisan, and we're, hopeful that we can move them along this session. And then the state laws are all pretty much examples of Sarah's laws in the states. And what's really exciting about it is that, as you can see, they're in conservative states and, moderate states. And so to the extent you are interested in bringing a version of Sarah's Law to your state or a more expansive version of Sarah's Law to your state, please reach out. We've had a lot of success bringing these and we can share model legislation. We've worked really closely with survivors and other advocates to do that. And so I think that's a great place to stop. I know that was a lot. So thank you all for your time. I know it's a very heavy subject, but a hopeful one as well. There's been a lot of progress on the issue of disrupting the abuse to prison pipeline. And, it's been an honor to work with so many survivors in this movement, all of whom have been courageously sharing their stories and urging our lawmakers and decision makers to really step up to take action and disrupt this, harmful trajectory for so many young people across the country.
Yay, thank you so much. This was a lot of beautiful wisdom and information. And I love that, we're kind of ending it at a place where there's hope. there's work that needs to be done, that is happening, and these are very tangible ways that we all can get involved in, and maybe build capacity um, for the vision of a world where women, girls, and youth can heal and thrive. And so, thank you for allowing us to go there, Yasmin. I'm wondering, folks, if anyone has any burning questions or clarification needs, or even just some affirmations. We will have a closing where we will invite you to share something that resonated with you or that you're taking with you. But just wanted to give folks space to interact and kind of share what's alive for you in this moment. You can use the chat or unmute.
Well, for me, my name is Lisette. Hello. For me and my experience with this workshop, I I feel like everything makes sense and falls into place as to like why things are happening. Because to me, it was like, why is this happening? Like, there's an explosion of this all of a sudden all over the media. But first of all, maybe now we have more data. And second of all, like, this explains why a lot of the youth feel like, you know, it's in a way like they've had that childhood experience with maybe abuse and how they can easily fall more into that in the more easily fall into that in their adulthood, you know, because maybe they don't have the resources or various other aspects. But this is really like an eye opener for me, so thank you for your information.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jasmine. This is Belen speaking, and your presentation was so informative and eye-opening. Like there was a lot of things that I had never thought about, just like how more vulnerable girls and femme identifying young people that are in the system already, how much vulnerable they are, and just like those statistics. I've watched the documentaries on Netflix, and I've definitely been shocked by the laws that exist and how they're, like you mentioned, double victimized. And I'm really interested in learning more about how to help this cause, and also just like creating that priority for those that are already in the system. So I thank you for your knowledge, and thank you for sharing space with us and sharing these really important facts with us as we continue to share um, our medicine with those that need it. I'm really grateful for you to do the same. Thank you.
My pleasure. Honestly, it's a real pleasure, and thank you for your attention. It was a very heavy subject, but and I feel like it's once you kind of see all the data, it's intuitive and it makes sense because I think many of us know these young people were these young girls, and it gives a narrative and story to situations and cases that we know or have personally experienced all too well. So, it's a privilege to be able to share that.
Hi, this is Sarah. I thank you so much. Yes, it's so eye-opening. It's information we've heard, but presented, with data. Like sometimes we need to hear it, like how does this translate to what's really going on in our community and what we see out in the streets. Thank you for this presentation. It's perfect in terms of like we need to know where we're at so we can get the heck out of these situations. So thank you for those suggestions also, because I think one of the main aspects is we cannot stay silent. We have to get political. Our vote, our social security number, everything has a value to this, to every single GDP in every world, every citizen, this is just basic economics. But one of the things I wanted to bring forth is the healing aspect. With Shanachli, with where we come from, we wanted to focus on epigenetics, what we do know. We do know that, yes, we inherit trauma. Yes, we inherit, phobias from our ancestors' experiences. But when we together as a community, sister to sister, compañera, comrade to comrade, comadre to comadre, my sister, my co-worker, my community, my family, when we connect, when we allow us to connect, especially with young people, right? Those who haven't fully developed their prefrontal cortex, right? I'm talking about young people. We are actually able to alter their DNA. So the trauma, the pain, where they've been, there's so much hope if we have a true, beautiful connection. Now, what this young person needs is to have healthy adults around them that are able to provide them support, and that alters DNA. And so, as we move from these very tough data points, that we have to know the language. What you said was clear. If white men build the consciousness to not buy children, youth, girls, whoever, 75% of the whole market goes away, is what it looks like, right? On, roughly. But again, I just want us to walk away knowing that every single effort we make every day, that one hug you give your youth, that one like, yo, you did a good job, or hey, I'm holding you accountable because I care. Every single effort we make is altering their DNA to be able to come out of, whatever trauma they've been through. So I just kind of want to throw that in there too, because it was a lot of heavy data. And I'm just so blessed that, you're a chingona, you're a warrior, Yasmin. Thank you so much, because you're taking this, you are also that spearhead, because these conversations are tough. And so thank you for the work that you do.
Oh, my pleasure. And I want to end on a positive note, because I want to highlight that, sometimes people feel very hopeless and, once they hear things like this. And, I just want to highlight that so many of these young people are so brilliant. I heard this quote the other day that someone was saying, I'm less interested in Albert Einstein and more fascinated by the fact that there were, thousands of people with equal talent who, were coiled away and in jail cells and died in genocides and were never able to realize their potential. And what I want to say is that so many of these young people, that all of us are committed to, that one relationship with a safe adult, with a mentor, with them can change the course of their life. And so the quote that I shared about the foster care to trafficking pipeline, that young girl who'd spent basically her whole life in foster care and was trafficked from the ages of 10 to 17. She went on to testify before Congress on legislation, made some brilliant recommendations that ended up becoming federal law, ended up becoming one of Glamour's Women of the Year, ended up becoming, after that, one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people, ended up graduating from honors from an HBCU, and is doing amazing. She's a mom. She has a beautiful, young son right now who's like 2.5, and she's doing amazing right now. And she's an inspiration, and she's brilliant. And so, when we invest in these young people and just, they have just even a couple caring adults who see them for who they are, they go on to lead incredible lives, And so I think that's the most amazing thing. Yes, horrible things have happened, but these young people are incredible. And I think that to me is the most hopeful part of this work. and the most inspiring part of this work. And again, it's a real privilege to get to do this work every day. And that to me continues to be the hopeful part, is seeing these young people, what they're capable of and what they go on to do when we invest in them just even a little bit. They're incredible.
Sorry, I know that Elizabeth was wanting to share.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I just wanted to thank you, Yasmin, for sharing with us today all of your knowledge, and we're grateful for all the work that you do. And I also, a lot resonated with me, but I wanted to touch on what Maestra Sara had shared about, so I work within the child welfare system. And so I'm in assessments and adoptions in the child welfare system. And I currently have a youth that has experienced a lot of this. And so I know earlier I had shared my mantra of I am love. And so although I work within a system that, I'm highly critical of, and I, struggle with a lot of the constraints in which like I have to work within. But I do my very, very, very best to offer my love and to see them and to affirm them and to just believe in them. And yeah, I made that connection when you had mentioned, Sarah, about really supporting them so they can change their, their DNA and their trajectory. They just really need our love and our support to do that. And I always pray that that I do that for them, and that I can be that one of the people that they cross paths with, and that truly sees them and reminds them of who they are. Thank you.
So beautiful. On this note, I'm just being mindful of our time. We just want to remind folks that are here that are not naturally trained facilitators, as well as folks that watch the recording, that the Shinatri curriculum is how we disrupt the abuse to prison pipeline. And so we invite you to join us. We're going to have our upcoming training in Los Angeles this upcoming May 7th to 10th. And we hope that you will join us in bringing hope, healing for youth, for ourselves, for our communities, because the health of the facilitator determines the health of the circle. And so we need more of us that are, weaving our cosmovisiones, our culture, and our healing as part of the work, right? And so thank you all for joining us, for being here with us, for sharing space, for healing in real time, and for the amazing work that is being done on the ground and that will be done moving forward. Thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we will close out.